below Union Square on 4th Avenue. Not today, but then there were rows of small bookstores, a lot of them run by European emigres, many of them Spanish refugees, Spanish anarchist refugees, who were also quite eager to talk and had lots of pamphlets and real original documentary material. Actually, when I wrote about this 20 years later, I used mostly documentary material I had picked up as a young teenager. It wasn't available. A lot of it's available now. It wasn't then. And that was a pretty inspiring picture, I felt. The Spanish Revolution, at least I felt and feel, was a really inspiring moment, which I think is why it elicited such a vicious response from every corner of power. That's quite important to remember. Communists, fascists, liberal democracies, all combined on crushing this. This was something they couldn't tolerate. Then they could have a fight later about who picks up the spoils. Actually, there were anarchist proposals that I felt were not unreasonable. They're disparaged, of course, in the West, but for how to win the Civil War was anarchist thinkers like Camillo Berneri, who was murdered by the communists in May 1937. One of the leading anarchist thinkers. He proposed that he pointed out, I think, as it turned out quite correctly, that they'd never win a conventional war. For one reason, because the commitment to the war on the part of the population had seriously declined after the revolution was crushed. They had lost what they had fought for, and they didn't care very much who was going to pick up the spoils. He pointed out, and of course, the fascists were being directly supported by Hitler and Mussolini, and the West was not opposed to that. It's hard, you may forget now, but fascism had a pretty good image in the West in the late 30s. Mussolini was that admirable Italian gentleman, as Roosevelt called him. Hitler was regarded by the State Department as, in the late 30s, as a moderate who was holding off the forces of left and right, so we shouldn't be too critical of him. The United States had a consul in Berlin up until Pearl Harbor, who was sending back dispatches saying you shouldn't be too hard on the Nazis. They're doing some things we don't like, but they're still kind of moderates. His name is George Kennan. You don't read that in the biographies, but that's not untypical of the period. Roosevelt, for example, there was a Neutrality Act, theoretically. The United States was not supposed to allow support for either side in the Civil War. And Roosevelt was very bitter about any attempt by somebody to say, send a pistol to the Republic. He couldn't stop it by force, but he bitterly condemned it. On the other hand, the State Department couldn't notice what I was reading in the left-wing press at the time, and was later conceded 20 years later, that the United States had authorized the Texaco Oil Company, which was run by an outright Nazi, open Nazi, had authorized them to they had a contract to ship oil to the Republic. They switched it to shipping oil to the fascist forces, which is the one thing that Hitler and Mussolini couldn't provide. They couldn't find that. The left press could find it, but the State Department couldn't. Well, going back to Berneri, what he proposed was that in Spain itself, the popular forces should fight a guerrilla war. That's an old Spanish tradition. In fact, that's where guerrilla wars were initiated under Napoleon. Fight a guerrilla war in Spain itself, and in Morocco, call for support the Moroccan liberation forces that were trying to free themselves from French and British imperial and Spanish imperial control. That was the base of Franco's army. They were Moorish troops coming from northern Africa. So his idea was fight a revolutionary war. support them in their efforts to overthrow imperialist control that he thought would erode the fascist armies, just as in Spain itself the popular forces were fighting, but until they were crushed. Well, that's if you read the scholarship on the matter up till today, that's kind of dismissed as a sort of a romantic joke, as the whole anarchist movement is. But I don't think it was. That was my initial exposure to it.